It's 2 o'clock. I'm Olive Martini, and this is the Working on Wellness Radio Forum, which we do the second Wednesday of every month. And I think that's a little bit loud for one of our guests here. You just need to turn that down a little bit. We've got in the studio today Dr. Paul Cunningham, who's a physician board certified in family medicine, geriatrics, hospice, and palliative care. And he's joined by Bertha Cooper, a nurse by profession and author of Women Were Only Old Once. And today we're talking about death and dying and the questions that come along with that. Dr. Cunningham, welcome back.
Thanks. Good to be here.
So tell us a little bit about why you chose this topic.
All right. Well, Bertha can jump in at any time. So for anyone who's been listening in recent years, or I guess the last couple of years now, Bertha and I have started a series, if you will, on taboo or difficult discussions or topics. And we thought it was time to talk about end of life and all the things that go along with it. And then Bertha may choose to share some recent experiences on her own end. But as a physician who's been in the community for 22 years now, with a passion and specialty for caring for older adults, i.e. geriatrics, and end-of-life care, hospice and palliative care. This is a topic that I spend a lot of time on professionally, so it's one near and dear to my heart. Bertha?
Yes, I wanted us to have this topic in part because of a very personal experience I had. My husband died in August, and we had known about we were told 2 years ago that he would die in 6 months. So I'm sure it's not an unfamiliar experience to other people. And I wanted to contribute that to this conversation because it's poignant. It's something that everyone will or has experienced before. And I think we don't talk about death. I discovered when I wrote about it, I write a column for the Sequim Gazette, and I have written several related to my husband's death and the process and the things we had to think about. And I had many comments from people that you wrote about this. How could you? They didn't say it in a way that was critical of what I had done, but how unusual it was to actually talk about death. So when Paul and I talked, I think, well, we better talk about it because it's obviously a taboo subject.
Well, tell us how you prepared. How did you prepare when you started talking about this subject, and how do you prepare for the end of a loved one?
Do you want me to?
Sure, go for it.
Sure.
I'll jump in.
I have one experience, and I need to say that there are a lot of different experiences. My husband died a timely death in the sense that he was old. He was 97 when he died. He had kind of a natural passing in that sense. So he and I were told 2 years ago that he was declining and that he would die, and that gave us a lot of time to prepare and to talk about it. We knew, because there was an age difference, that this was inevitable, that it would happen. So our preparation was lots of conversation about what that meant, and separating and together and crying together. I think it was a very human thing that probably many listeners in this for this show are feeling the same. So preparation is very individual. There are very practical things that you need to do, and we'll probably be covering those as well. But this is the emotional, the hard, raw part of it.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is, for those who were listening a few minutes ago, Bertha mentioned that her husband, Paul, had gone on hospice 2 years ago, and one of the questions out there might be, but Dr. Paul, I thought hospice was only in the last 6 months of life. So I'd like to speak to that. But before that, I also want to say, we can talk about the nuts and bolts of when someone should be referred for hospice and who qualifies and all that. But I would say, perhaps more importantly, is that individuals are talking about their goals of care and what a, quote, good death, unquote, looks like to them, because everyone is different. And I bring that up. I know the details of Bertha and Paul Cooper's journey, and it's not my place to go into the details, but what I would say from the medical side of things, having known them both as patients and then personally, one of the things I try to get at as a physician is what is important to you, what is your line in the sand, and so forth and so on. So, for example, if someone is deteriorating, perhaps from cardiovascular disease, lung disease, a progressive neurologic disease like dementia or otherwise, folks get to a point where more interventions offer less value, maybe more harm than good. Folks get to the point where they just want to be in their home. They don't want to go to the ER. They don't want to go to the hospital. And when you start asking those type of questions and answering, yeah, I really don't want to go through those things, it's a good time to be talking amongst yourself and talking to your physician or others about your goals of care and how we can assist you from the medical perspective. So we can come back later to the idea of hospice is for 6 months or less, but the simple explanation for that is indeed hospice is based on current condition and prognosis. You're more likely than not to die in the next 6 months, but when 6 months and a day rolls around, that doesn't mean you get kicked off hospice. It just means, are we still there? If we look at the situation, do we still meet that criteria? If the case is yes, then you continue hospice, and occasionally you can go 2 years or more.
So how do you plan for an unknown event, an unknown circumstances? How do you plan for that?
Yeah, well, Olive, thanks for stealing my words there. I think I maybe gave that to you. And you said, how do you plan for an unknown event or and unknown circumstances? So I use that phrase, and I'll expand upon it a little bit too, which is when you start talking about advanced directives, living wills, choosing a surrogate decision maker, durable power of attorney for healthcare. One of the challenges is how do you plan, often many years, if not decades in advance, to plan specifically for an unknown event at an unknown time under unknown circumstances. And that is a challenge. And one thing I would say, and we could talk more, is one of my mentors back in medical school and residency in Hospice and Palliative Care said, a piece of paper is only as good as the conversations behind it, right? So you may have a living will that says, do this, don't do that. But what's important is when the time comes around, that people around, that you yourself know, and the people around you who might be making decisions for you, if you're unable to, know what your hopes and fears are, what your goals are, what those lines in the sand are. And maybe Bertha can reflect upon that.
I was deep in thought about the last question. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
But that's all right. But
yeah.
let me just add to, in the sense of what our experience was, because we did have specific goals, and I think that's what what is your goal? And one of our goals was that Paul would be at home in our house. And the second one was that he would be in our bed, not a hospital bed, which was somewhat of a struggle with the hospice staff because they were saying, well, soon, you need a hospital bed because you'll hurt your back or whatever. But we made it. We made the goals come true, and I'm pretty sure that Paul made certain of that.
What are some practical tools? Tell us a little bit more about advanced directives and living wills.
I will. At first, I can just throw a few numbers at you, and it'll be the only time I do it today in response to Bertha's comments. So when you look at polls, 60% of people say that making sure their family is not burdened by tough decisions is extremely important. 56% have not communicated their end-of-life wishes, and 70% they say they prefer to die at home, just as a few examples. And then I won't say the numbers, but suffice to say, majority of people do not die at home. Majority of people do not convey their goals and wishes to family. So even though folks want it to happen, it doesn't always happen, right? So tell me your question again.
Advanced directives
Yeah.
and living wills. And I have a question for
Yeah.
you before we get too far into advanced directives. If you don't have anyone, you're the surviving
Yes.
spouse. And how do you find someone? And now I know you could ask a neighbor or a friend, but if you didn't feel comfortable doing that, could you ask your doctor to be that person?
Great question. And I hear it often because especially we're in a retirement community, right? Some folks have moved away from family thousands of miles away, and or folks are living long into the 80s, 90s, or beyond, and they've outlived everyone around them. So this is a common question. The first answer is it would not be appropriate for your healthcare provider to be your surrogate decision maker, okay? But certainly talking to them about it and what's important to you can be important, because if let's say, for sake of discussion, you never appoint someone and something happens to you, you're unable to speak for yourself, you're seriously ill, perhaps at the end of life, and decisions need to be made. If you have communicated to your primary care provider, be a physician, nurse practitioner, otherwise, and that's documented, that can be one way of conveying your wishes, all right? But in a perfect ideal world, everyone should have a durable power of attorney for healthcare, also known as a surrogate decision maker. And often it's a spouse, often it's an adult child, often they don't exist, or they're not someone that an individual wants to entrust those things to for all the reasons we could probably figure out. And then it's perfectly fine to be talking to a neighbor or a friend. And I think you see that increasingly as individuals outlive other family members or their spouses in particular. So the most important thing is just finding someone who you trust, someone you're comfortable talking to things about, and someone, it helps if they're local, right? Because if your surrogate decision maker is 3,000 miles away, that just becomes logistically challenging.
So you want to make friends right away.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about advanced directives and living wills. How do you go about that?
Yeah, well, let me, if I can, and you guys have a website you can put these things on. I want to just throw out a couple of websites that I find really helpful.
Okay.
In terms of just starting the conversations and how to formulate the questions for yourself, your family, and loved ones, I like 5wishes.org, 5wishes.org, and I also like theconversationproject.org. Okay, and we'll post those, I think, on your website. Is that fair, Olive?
Yes, that will probably go on the SQM Free Clinic's website, and that's squimfreeclinic.org.
Yeah, and we'll repeat that at the end. But those two websites in particular are a great resource, zero to minimal cost. The one that charges the cost is for like the price of paper and is walking you through the conversations. Okay, so I'll just leave it at that for now. We can talk some details. The other website I like, oddly enough, is the Washington State Medical Association website, which is wsma.org, and they actually are a great resource for having the discussion. But if you go to their website and then click on the resources tab and then follow that down to advanced care planning, they actually have free forms that you can download, print out, and fill out yourself and complete. So you don't have to pay someone to do a living will for you or a surrogate decision maker. These things are readily available, and the WSMA, Washington State Medical Association.org website offers a free one, and it's actually really user-friendly.
This is the Working on Wellness Radio Forum that is put on by the Dungeness Valley Health and Wellness Clinic, SQM's Free Clinic. And my guests in the studio today are Dr. Paul Cunningham and Bertha Cooper. And we're talking about those kinds of things that you just are hard to talk about, the taboos of death and dying. And so one of the questions that we have are, Dr. Cunningham, how do you approach caring conversations with loved ones and families when it comes to how the let's talk about the emotions of that conversation, and then a little bit more about the practical side?
Yeah, well, I do an entire presentation on this, but that said, what I would say is you need to figure out how to initiate it, and that's going to be different for different families, right? Classically, for those of us who talk about these things, we say, holiday dinner time is a good time, to just bring it up. But also, I invite my patients to blame me. So whether it's at Thanksgiving or Christmas, maybe not Christmas dinner, but some dinner gathering or other family gathering, say, I was talking to my doctor and they encouraged me to start communicating some important things to you. So you can use that as an excuse to enter into it. Or, you just say, it's important to me that you guys all understand how I would make decisions if different circumstances arise. So there's a lot of forays into it, and every family individual is going to be different. But just put a shot across the bow, or the good old, I want to talk about something important, and it's not necessarily a fun thing to talk about. It's not things we often talk about over the dinner table, but it's important to me. Can we do that?
And if you are asking a parent, for instance,
Sure.
We're concerned because we don't know what you want.
Yes. Well, I love that. Well, first of all, recognize that even our parents, aging parents, still have autonomy, still have agency, and you need to start by asking permission, right? Just like anything. Hey, Mom, Dad, is it okay if we start talking about something that we've been thinking a lot about? You've moved away, or you're getting older, and especially if there's been an event. You were hospitalized last month, and you remember there were some decisions to be made, and I would like to kind of use that as a launching point for us to talk about the future, and so that's one way.
Well, during the break, Bertha had this question for you, Dr.
Okay.
Paul. She asked, how do you tell a patient, like we talked about, how do you set an expiration date? You have so many months to live.
Right.
And what does death look like? Months, weeks, days, and hours. What does the body go through? What can people expect?
Right. Well, the first part of that question I'll answer similar to how I just did. If I'm seeing a patient, I might say something like, well, you've been in the emergency room twice in the last month or two. You've been hospitalized twice in the last few months. And is it okay if we have a discussion about how that was for you and how we want to plan for your medical care moving forward? And I'll use words like, I know a lot about medicine, I know a lot about treatment, but I don't necessarily know is what is important to you and what are some of the goals that are important to you as we move forward in your healthcare. But so if there's been frequent visits to the emergency room or recent hospitalizations, that's always a good time to start those conversations. And sometimes folks ask me, or you'll hear, well, should I be concerned if my doctor broaches a topic? No, you shouldn't be concerned necessarily, but you should be pleased, because the truth of the matter is not all physicians, nurse practitioners, physician assistants necessarily want to talk about this, or maybe don't think they have the skill set to talk about it. So sometimes a patient needs to initiate it. So I would harken back to how you're going to talk to your parents or how you're going to talk to your family. As far as you ask a question about prognosticating, how to determine life expectancy and so forth and so on. That's a really hard one. There are some tools out there, believe it or not. And I think for anyone who wants to look this one up, it's called eprognosis. .ucsf, University of California, San Francisco.edu. So E as in like electronic prognosis, .ucsf or University of California, San Francisco .edu education. And that's actually has some tools for determining expectancies. But everyone's different, right? So let's just look at a few examples. Some of the more difficult ones are dementia, and I've taken care of countless people with dementia. Dementia course can vary dramatically from, someone enters advanced stages of dementia. By that, I mean they're largely bedbound, they're not speaking at all, kind of being fed by hand and all that. Even in those situations, folks can live months or even years more, right? So neurologic conditions like dementia or other progressive neurologic conditions like Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, or Lou Gehrig's disease, aka ALS. Those things have wide variability. And so there's very specific markers, and I'll come come back to that. Things like advanced cancer are a little more predictable, particularly if you've exhausted curative treatment options. Then we can predict things a little more deliberately. And the other ones that are difficult are heart disease, like congestive heart failure, or advanced lung disease, like emphysema, COPD, because they can vary widely, okay? Having given that disclaimer, what we start to look at in particular is functional status. A month ago or a year ago, were you up working in the garden, working in the shop, doing all sorts of things, traveling, and now you're spending more time in bed, your energy level is lower, things like that. Those are kind of signals that things are advancing, right? Now, when we start talking about folks who are actively dying, by actively dying, I mean days, weeks, or maybe a few months, then there's some very specific things we see. So if you're on hospice and you're basically bedbound at this point, once you're taking very little in as far as food, you can live quite a long time without eating, but once you stop taking hydration, liquids, then really when you truly stop taking liquids, hydration, you're talking days, maybe a couple weeks. Food, you can go a long time, but so those type of things. And then as it gets closer to days or hours, then you start, and Bertha may choose to share some experience or not, but you start to see folks are definitely bedbound, folks are sleeping more, and then they get to the point where I wouldn't call it sleeping, they're just not waking up and interacting as much. So once you get into that to the point where you're really not waking up, interacting with people, you're not taking fluids in, then you can start talking about days to the end of life.
Well, we got a question from a listener. Is a feeding tube a comfort measure?
Oh, great question. Is a feeding tube a comfort measure? Well, I'll answer that in the following way. There are some instances where a feeding tube makes a lot of sense. Let me give you a really clear example. You've been diagnosed with some type of head and neck cancer, maybe throat, esophagus, things like that. You're going to have surgery. You're not going to be able to swallow for some amount of time, often weeks to months. Putting a feeding tube in makes a lot of sense, right? Because you're hoping for a curative treatment and you need to maintain hydration and nutrition. So a feeding tube in situations where it's you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, right? That makes a lot of sense. Where feeding tubes come up and get really interesting are particularly around dementia. Folks, when they get into the later stages of dementia, no longer eating or drinking, and then they start what we call aspirating, right? Things are going down the air pipe, the windpipe, rather than the esophagus. And folks sometimes think, well, if we put a feeding tube in, that will help. This is a discussion of itself, but in the advanced stages of dementia and other progressive neurologic conditions, putting a feeding tube in actually is detrimental. It doesn't extend life. It could, strangely enough, shorten life, because you can then get what we call ascending aspiration. If you're putting food into a stomach that is shutting down because the body's shutting down, then it's going to start backing up and going that way. So it's situation dependent, but a feeding tube can be a comfort measure, but it also can just cause more harm than good. I just want to cite the one very specific exception to what I just said. Folks with ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, when they lose the ability to safely swallow, a feeding tube can actually help them extend their life years, right? But that's a very specific situation.
How does one ask for death medication?
Oh, yeah. So one easy question followed by the other, right? So I think this question is about what is sometimes referred to physician-assisted death, physician-assisted suicide, and more recently, MAID. Let me see if I get it. Medical assistance in dying, okay? So in Washington State and a number of states now, I've lost track, it's probably over 20. If you meet the criteria for hospice, 6 months or less, and two providers, a physician and or a nurse practitioner, PA, agree to that, you in Washington State, or again in other states, you can qualify for or meet the criteria for getting a medication that would hasten your death. And how do you do it? Well, you find a provider who's willing to participate. And as a physician, I'm not obligated to participate. Any healthcare provider can opt out. As you can imagine, it's a charged topic. And so, but you find I would start with your primary care provider, right? And if they're not willing to participate, which is sometimes the case, they hopefully at least can point you in the right direction. And also, I would say that Washington Death with Dignity, formerly known, some people might have remembered Compassion and Choices. If I'm not mistaken, they're now called Washington Death with Dignity. They are an organization that is standing by and just waiting by the phone to answer questions about physician-assisted death, and even get you to a physician or other provider who's willing to participate if you can't find someone else.
Let's talk a little bit about grieving and those left behind. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, first, if I could just go back to something we talked about earlier, and that was the physician telling us, Paul was in the hospital, and with acute congestive heart failure. He was feeling great. Physician came in, the hospital list, and told us he was terminal, that he was eligible for hospice, and of course, that was not news we wanted to hear, and we felt very bad. But what it allowed us to do was to go ahead and mobilize our family and get them involved. You were talking earlier about talking to your family and telling them. And once we knew, it was an easy thing for us to do because we wanted them to know and to get on board with that. Leaping ahead, and that's a big leap for me because my husband survived, and rather than 6 months, he survived 2 years. But it was 2 years of decline, and I kept losing pieces of him all the time. Every day there was a little piece, but he was there, and it was good, and now he's not. And grieving is an experience that I have never had in my life. I have never felt like I have felt the last 5 months since he died. And it's not even one I can particularly describe to you. I'm sure it's different for all people. There are resources in our community. There are grieving groups. There are groups that are brought together, say, by the hospice organizations, where they have a social worker or someone who is skilled to facilitate, to allow groups of people who have had a recent loss talk about it, and they organize it in such a way that they can do it. It's a painful experience. And when you've, like we had been married 54 years, and even though I knew, because he was older than I was by considerable years, it's a very difficult, lonely experience, and nobody can fix that for you. It is what it is, and it's unlike anything that I have ever experienced before. I'm hopeful, though. I have support of family and friends and things that, but it's one you just have to go through it. You just have to do it.
So when your husband was in hospice, did they give you some advice as to where to go after he was gone, as far as groups?
They had one. Let's see, how did that work? They had their own group as one, and then I had actually friends tell me of other groups that I could go to. My hair cutter told me about one, as people just mobilized and said they're there, and they may not be for everyone. Some people more prefer the privacy of their grief. Not everyone talked at these gatherings that we had, some people more than others. Everyone was doing what felt right to them in talking about whether they talked about the person they lost or what it was like or how they were feeling. They're very valuable resources, and they're there. Hospice knows about them, both the volunteer and Assured Hospice, both have them and talk with them.
Yeah. And what I would add to that is, for your listeners, you do not have to, if your loved one did not die with hospice, which is not uncommon. About 52% of folks in this country die with hospice on board. And actually, that seems like a high number, but a lot of people don't. You don't have to have been part of hospice to take advantage of the bereavement support group. So both Assured Hospice of Clallam County and Volunteer Hospice of Clallam County both have bereavement groups, and they both would welcome anyone into them who need that support.
And it's all ages. I mean, in the group I was in, I think the youngest person was in her 30s and had lost her mother. Maybe even someone younger than so it's a mix of people. Good experience, positive experience.
And Olive, if we have a minute before we go on to the next question, I just want to go back to Bertha and her husband Paul's experience. Some of your listeners may be thinking, well, this hospitalist came in and says you're terminal and you're going to die, maybe not in those words, but and then he lived 2 more years. Were they wrong? I would say absolutely not. I wish I could find that hospitalist and hug them right now and thank them, as maybe Bertha would too, because let's say at that moment in time, Bertha and Paul accepted that prognosis and accepted hospice. If Paul had rallied and instead of slowly but surely deteriorating, actually just got a new lease on life and, off he goes, well, great. And you discharged from hospice. And but at that moment in time, their goals were aligned with less interventions, right? And so embracing hospice made a lot of sense. And again, things can change. We talked, how do you plan for unpredictable situation, time, and events, etc. And this is a good example. And when sometimes some of your listeners may be thinking, well, if I accept hospice, aren't I giving up? And, easy for me to say as a hospice and palliative care certified physician, but no, the complete opposite. It's not giving up. It is a shift in focus and energy and resources. When you have exhausted curative measures, we want to make sure that we're doing everything possible to make your quality of life better, more comfortable, and strangely enough, in some situations, hospice actually prolongs life because you're now, and it's not really surprising, you now all of a sudden have a team of people in your home, a nurse, perhaps a personal caregiver, a social worker, a chaplain, a volunteer, and you wrap people around in services and support them, and remarkably enough, they may actually do better, and that's okay. In the hospice world, we celebrate that.
If I could add, one of the happiest times I had seen my husband was when I came back from talking to the hospice nurse and told him, she said you could live another year. And he just went, yay! He was and that made him so happy because it removed that it's going to be imminent. And indeed he did. He lived another year and a half from that time. So, but he needed hospice because he was declining, and it wasn't in a lot of pain, so he didn't need a lot of pain management, but he needed other symptom management for things that were happening to him.
I got to add on if I can. So this is just such a perfect example. Really, this is the crux of this hour, Olive. That's why I'm coming back to this. Because let's take a parallel universe. This person did not tell Bertha and Paul that his condition had exhausted curative measures and, he was terminal, quote unquote. If no one has that conversation with you or vice versa, then what could happen? Well, you can bounce in and out of the emergency room 3 to 23 times in the next year. For what purpose? You're not prolonging your life. You're not in your own home. You might get hospitalized half of those times and have medical interventions that are not going to prolong your life. And I said earlier, everyone's path is different. I'm not saying Paul and Bertha's path was the right one for other folks, but you can see how one scenario can play out and another can. So if you don't talk about it, and this is the other thing I stress, the American healthcare system is exquisitely designed to do more. Remember back in 2008, whatever, McCain, Palin, we talked about death panels, and it was all politics and rhetoric. But in fact, this country is designed to do more. You have to say enough is enough. That is the design. And if you don't, we will, God bless us, we will do more and more until you say, uncle. So, and I'm being a little dramatic for the purposes of demonstrating it, but really, it's easy to go back and forth to the hospital, back and forth to the ER, and to have people do interventions on you. The question is it aligned with your values, your hopes, your fears, and is it going to result in a better or longer quality of life?
And the caregiver is the one who benefits because she's getting that education or that information from the hospice person that's coming in and telling her, this is okay, don't worry about it. You can manage this. A lot of reassurance, a lot of benefits for the caregiver and consequently for the dying person.
When you are at the end, and a lot of times people don't realize that they have options, talked a little bit about that, Dr. Cunningham, again, to let people know that if you're not offered an option, maybe it's something that you can ask about.
Yeah, great question. So Bertha shared with us earlier how while they were in the hospital a couple years ago, someone explicitly came out and said, Paul's condition is such that we would term it as deem it terminal, right? And granted, 2 years went by, but not everyone is going to be engaged with a healthcare provider, be it in the emergency room, in the hospital, or the clinic, that is going to call these things out. So I would say a few things. If you're thinking about it, talk to your provider, right? If listen to this radio show has prompted you, then number one, start talking to your family and friends or the people close to you going to be helping make decisions, and schedule a visit with your provider. Medicare pays your provider to do advanced care planning. Unlimited amount of times. I mean, I imagine Medicare would get worked up if it was multiple times, but it's not just like once in your life. You can schedule a visit with your provider if you're on Medicare to say, I want to talk about advanced care planning. You can go and you talk about your living will. You can go and talk about a post form, a whole nother discussion. You can go in and tell them what your goals and wishes are, and they will get paid for that. So number one, if you or your loved one or somebody you know is, again, in the palliative care world that I've inhabited over the years, we say if someone's been in and out of the hospital more than a few times in the last year, it's time to have that conversation, right? And so if you are declining and you're in and out of an inpatient facility in particular, it's definitely time to have these discussions, right? When I first got into my geriatric training, it would have been 2001, 2002 at Swedish Hospital, University of Washington, we talked about the holy grail of geriatrics is this. Everyone lives a hearty life and then just falls off the cliff suddenly at pick your age, 80, 90, or 100. The reality is, especially with medical advances, and Bertha may choose to share some experience here, it's a stepwise thing. So it's not like your face. Yes, some people have an ache and pain go in and they're told they have metastatic cancer X, Y, or Z. That happens. But when it comes to heart disease, lung disease, neurologic disease, dementia, Parkinson's, things like that, these are incremental things. So it's not one black or white time, right? And importantly, these conversations, it's not a one and done. First, we talked about how do you start the conversation with family, with your provider, and how do you communicate these things. And then, lo and behold, things change a month from now, or how you feel about something may change a year or two from now. I had breakfast with a wise friend of mine this morning, retired academic, counselor type, and he reminded me that Freud says there's one thing we cannot plan for, our own death, or we cannot imagine. And I believe that, right? Bertha has experienced the death of her beloved husband, but think it's hard for us as a human condition. Maybe it's an evolution, a protective thing that we can't imagine it. So, and I mention that just because how you think about something right now may change, and that's okay. If you say, do this, don't do that now, and a year from now you change your mind, guess what? You can tear that piece of paper up and start all over again.
Okay. So let's talk, this will be my last question. So help us understand what someone goes through in the very last hours or days that they have. What happens? How does the body shut down, and what can people expect?
I'll start, and Bertha, if you want to comment, or did you want?
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I hope, not that we're here to advertise hospice, but if you're, I dare say, fortunate enough to see what's coming, by all means, get hospice. It's Assured hospice is covered by Medicare or Medicaid or commercial insurance, and volunteer hospice is by donations alone, and they don't charge anything. So this is not a cost. If anything, it saves people money, but let's not go down that pathway. But but I would like to think that everyone who has the opportunity to know that they are dying, that they are on hospice, because it's not just for you, it's for your loved one. So even if you're a cowboy, farmer, a logger, and you, by golly, you've taken care of things, well, good for you. But how about the people around you? And you're going to need support, and they're going to need support. And what's better than having a team come in, a nurse, a volunteer, a social worker, a chaplain? I don't want a chaplain. Fine. Tell them you don't want that chaplain. They get it. They get told that all the time. But first of all, have those services in place, because the end of life can be much more comfortable if we put some simple medications in place. Whole nother discussion, but all you really need in place are two medications, a liquid form of morphine and a liquid form of lorazepam, which is like Valium. Between those two medicines and a fan to blow on your face and a comfortable bed, we can palliate and make most people comfortable, okay? But to answer your question, the end of life looks like this. You're sleeping all the time. You're not eating, and eventually you're not drinking, and eventually you're not responding to even rub on the chest and that type of thing, right? But importantly, literature shows that you can still hear things, and you can still sense things. So even in the last days of life, making sure you're comfortable, think about that important time with the loved ones, you and your loved ones, to kind of be having, what's important end of life. I forgive you. Please forgive me. I love you. Now I get tearful. Bertha, did you want to comment on that?
Without getting tearful,
Yeah.
that would be hard. No, my husband Paul had a recliner chair that he stayed in, and when he finally, that day, I think he knew he was going to die, and he went to our bed, to that. And he didn't require a lot of medication, which was really a blessing, because he was somewhat aware of what was going on. He was okay. He was at peace with it. And he didn't have medication that was distorting any of his thoughts or putting him to sleep. It was available, the exact same things, Demerol and lorazepam. And lorazepam is more of a relaxation.
Yeah, it's a benzodiazepine.
Yeah. And that was the one we did use for him. So, and he slept. He slept peacefully. He slept. It was quite what I would call a very natural passing from this time, and it was exactly what he wanted to do. So.
Well, I can't thank you enough for both being here. This is the Working on Wellness Radio Forum, which is always the second Wednesday of the month at 2 p.m. And this is sponsored by the Dungeness Valley Health and Wellness Clinic. They're one of 32 free clinics in the state of Washington, and the clinic is open to the public on Monday and Thursday evenings. The doors open at 4:30 p.m. No appointment is necessary. The SQM Free Clinic is here to serve anyone who has no health insurance or is underinsured by their health insurance policy. They're located at 777 North 5th Avenue, and their website is squimfreeclinic.org. And what we talked about here today will be on their website. And thanks again for coming in. This is good information.
Thanks, Olive. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Sure.